Well, I hope you're doing well. We're going to continue on with our devotional series on handling conflict. And last time we talked about how offense, for a Christian, the idea of offense, which is really a non biblical term, but biblically it's just anger directed towards another person because of some hurt or injury that's taken place in the life, that offense is actually a sin and that it's not right for a Christian to be offended. And we talked about how hurt is something that Christians can experience and that it's not unrighteous, but that when that hurt is not directed toward the sovereignty of God, but then is directed toward another person in anger, that act of hurt being directed towards another person in anger, that which produces the feeling of of being offended in the heart, that is actually sinful because it's an act of not of love but of anger. And so because of that, it is wrong for Christians to be offended in the definitional sense that we provided last time. Now, what I want to point out here is that one of the only way to really deal with conflict, to really manage conflict biblically, is to make sure that there are no excuses before we try to handle the conflict. And when we talk about offense and the fact that being offended is wrong for a Christian, one of the excuses that people often suggest, or that we all, even my own heart, we all do this, is we say, well, it wasn't. I have the right to be angry in this situation. Yeah, most of the time offense is wrong, but here in this situation, I have the right to be angry. I have righteous anger in my heart towards that person because of what it is that they did, that act of unrighteousness that was so great. Now, there's a couple of things that we need to say here. We need to sort of kick the legs out from under that a little bit, because we want to make sure that that before we proceed to handling offense, we need to remove the excuses that are the most common in our own hearts so that we're able to really handle our issues of conflict in a biblical way. So what do we need to say about righteous anger? Well, there's a couple things. Number one, it is possible to be angry and righteous. We see this all over the place in the Bible. In the first place, God, our Father, is angry, and he is never sinful. He's always righteous. And so it's possible to have anger and yet be righteous at the same time. Those two things can coexist. They're not mutually exclusive. Second, remember that Jesus was angry at various points in his ministry. And we see this very clearly, even in acts of physical violence. He drives the money changers out of the temple and he says, "You've made my Father's house a den of thieves." That's a sign or a picture of physical, even physically expressed anger against sinfulness in the temple. And he's doing that act as an act of righteous anger against their unrighteousness. We also see it expressed in his heart in John chapter 11 at the death of his friend Lazarus. He goes to the tomb and there's some false mourners around the tomb, and the text of John 11 says that that he was indignant at them. His spirit was angry because of what they were doing. There was sin taking place there. There's other places as well in the New Testament that anger is not necessarily classified as a sin. The most clear example is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. If you look that up, Paul says explicitly, "Be angry and yet do not sin." In other words, saying it's possible to have anger and not sin at the same time. What that means is that there is such a thing as righteous anger. It can exist. Righteous anger is a potential. Now, here's the problem. Everyone, when they've been sinned against, when they've been hurt, wants to think that their anger is righteous anger. It's very rare that someone says, that even my own heart, that we say, well, I'm angry, and I know my anger is sin. No, we all want to justify our sinful anger. We all want to justify our sinful anger because at the end of the day, we're self-righteous people and our pride has been hurt. And so we want to protect that sinful anger that we feel is fair and right. And so how do we classify righteous versus unrighteous anger? How do we know if our anger is righteous or unrighteous? And I want to give you three sort of litmus tests to check whether or not what you're feeling, if you're angry or if you're offended, whether or not what you're feeling is righteous anger or unrighteous anger. The first litmus test is that righteous anger is always related to the glory of God and not the glory of us. This is super important. When Jesus was angry in the temple, why was he angry? He was angry because they had turned his Father's house, which should have been a house of prayer, into a house of thieves, into a den of robbers. He says, "This is why I'm angry, because you are tarnishing the glory of God. The people of the world should be coming together to pray in the temple, and instead you are here stealing from them, taking money in the name of God. They are defaming the glory of God." Of course he had the right to be angry at that moment. And the anger that he expressed in John chapter 11 was because there were false mourners around the tomb of his friend Lazarus. Here's this true believer, this brother, essentially brother, the closeness in terms of their relationship, this close relationship of Christ, his close friend Lazarus, who's now died. And these false mourners, they're not genuinely mourning over his death. They're just there sort of with the sisters. It's sort of a disgusting scene, and Jesus is indignant at the fact that they are defaming the glory of God and even defaming his friend and his friend's honor as a Christian. They're sort of confusing the situation dramatically, and there's all sorts of things that are going on there that are unrighteous. And Jesus sees all of those things. He says, I'm indignant against that sinful behavior that they are expressing in this situation in John 11. And so we have pictures of righteous anger that are directly related to the glory of God. And we see this in other places as well. Paul in Galatians, he talks about the Judaizers who were coming in and teaching false things. And he says, and he's expressly angry at them. He uses some incredibly harsh language toward those false teachers. Why? Because they're defaming the glory of Christ by teaching a false gospel, by essentially dragging souls to hell. Paul gets angry because they're sinning against God, and in that sin, they are violating the glory of God by a violation of the gospel. So the first litmus test that we need to check our hearts, that we need to use to check our hearts is our anger related to the glory of God in the person of Christ in the gospel? Are we upset because God's glory is being tarnished because of some event? No, this is very tricky and very subtle, but you might be able to say, well, yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm angry because God's glory is being tarnished. This person sinned against me. That's a tarnishment of God's glory in some respects. There's lots of ways we're going to sort of parse that down. But the second litmus test is a little bit harder to get over, and that's the issue of this. The second test is true righteous anger is always spiritually informed. True righteous anger is still anger which is under the control of the Spirit. Now, you know this. What are the fruits of the Spirit? The fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. True righteous anger is anger according to the Spirit. True righteous anger is anger that is connected with love. It's connected with joy. It's connected with peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness. And most of all, when it comes to anger, self-control. True righteous anger is governed by these fruits of the Spirit because true righteous anger is in the heart of a person who is walking according to the Spirit. And so to say, well, I'm angry and that's why I'm yelling, is a violation of the command for gentleness and self-control in terms of the fruits of the Spirit. That is not righteous anger. Anger that is exercised in an ungentle way is not righteous anger. Anger that intrudes on and violates the joy that we have in Christ is not righteous anger. These things are not righteous anger, and therefore we ought not to call them righteous anger when we are not walking according to the fruits of the Spirit. Okay, so first test, is it for the glory of God? Second test, does it remain spiritual? Does the person who's being angry still walk according to the Spirit in all of the fruits of the Spirit while still being angry? Are they able to maintain those things at the same time? And the third litmus test is that righteous anger is always extremely short-lived. Paul says this in Ephesians 4:26, and he clarifies so clearly what righteous anger is. He says, be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. In other words, don't allow your anger to continue. It must be short-lived. True righteous anger will always, because it's governed by the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit, and the first of the fruits of the Spirit is love, true righteous anger for the violation of the glory of God will always funnel itself into either pity or the proclamation of the gospel or the care of that soul. This is exactly what Jesus did with the Pharisees. He was consistently pointing out their hypocrisy and pointing them to God, the true and living God. He was doing this with people around the tomb of Lazarus. What did he do? He said, I told you, you will see the glory of God. That's what he says in John chapter 11. He points them over and over and over again to Christ and to himself and to the gospel and to God the Father. When righteous anger was expressed, it always outed itself in mercy and humility and kindness and patience and love. So, 3 tests to see if your anger is righteous. Is it for the glory of God exclusively? Second, is it controlled by and informed by the fruits of the Spirit? And third, is it extremely brief, short-lived? If you can't meet all those tests, what that tells you is that your anger is not righteous, is not righteous anger. It's actually self-righteous anger, and that anger needs to be repented of. You need to come to God and confess that you really are angry against another person because your pride has been hurt, and because of that reality, because of what's happened in your heart, because of the hurt that they've caused you, even if the hurt is real, you need to take those hurts and come to God and understand that He's in sovereign control of your life, that He loves you, and then seek His wisdom on how to approach reconciliation. Okay, so we've looked at offense, now we've looked at righteous anger, and then next time we'll look at the first step toward seeking reconciliation. Thanks.